The late afternoon sun streamed through the towering glass windows of Los Angeles International Airport's exclusive first-class terminal, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Jim Carrey stood in line, a weathered backpack slung casually over his shoulder, wearing what he considered his most comfortable travel outfit, a well-loved faded tie-dye t-shirt, worn jeans that had seen better days, and his favorite old sneakers. His signature smile, the one that had charmed millions worldwide, played across his face as he observed the bustling scene around him. Behind him, the clicking of expensive heels announced the arrival of Victoria Blackwood, a fixture in Beverly Hills' social circles. Her Chanel suit, perfectly tailored in cream and black, probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The heavy scent of Clive Christian No. 1, the world's most expensive perfume, preceded her like an olfactory announcement of her status. Her fingers, adorned with several carats worth of diamonds, clutched her crocodile Hermes Birkin bag as if it were a shield against the commonness surrounding her. Victoria's carefully Botoxed features twisted into an expression of distaste as she eyed the man standing in front of her in the first-class line. In her world, first class wasn't just a service category. It was a lifestyle, a statement, an exclusive club that shouldn't admit just anyone with enough money to buy a ticket. And this man, with his casual demeanor and worn clothing, clearly didn't belong in her carefully curated universe. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, her voice dripping with manufactured politeness. "I believe the economy check-in is in Terminal 4. She adjusted her Cartier watch with deliberate slowness, a gesture meant to draw attention to the flash of precious metal on her wrist. Jim turned around, his eyes twinkling with that special kind of mischief that had made him famous. "Oh, is it?" he replied, his voice warm and genuinely friendly. "Thanks for letting me know, but I'm actually in the right place." He gestured to his first-class ticket with a good-natured shrug. Victoria's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched higher, threatening to disappear into her expertly highlighted hairline. "Really?" she drawled, each syllable coated with doubt. "How interesting." The word interesting carried enough venom to drop a small animal. A young check-in agent named Sarah watched the interaction with growing discomfort. She recognized Jim Carrey immediately, who wouldn't, but maintained her professional composure, understanding the actor's apparent desire to remain low-key. Sarah had been working at LAX long enough to encounter all types of celebrities, and she'd learned that some of the biggest stars were often the most unassuming. "First class really isn't what it used to be," Victoria continued, speaking to no one in particular, but ensuring everyone could hear. "I remember when it meant something, when there were standards." She pulled out her phone, manicured fingers flying across the screen as she presumably shared her outrage with her equally privileged social circle. Jim just smiled broader, if that was possible. He'd spent his career making people laugh, turning uncomfortable situations into moments of joy, and this was no different. He caught the eye of a young boy who was staring at him open-mouthed from the regular check-in line and gave him a quick wink. The boy's face lit up with recognition, but before he could say anything, Jim put a finger to his lips in a conspiratorial gesture. The boy nodded, grinning widely, now part of a secret that made him feel special. This small interaction didn't go unnoticed by Victoria, who interpreted it as further proof of the man's unsuitability for first-class travel. "I suppose anyone can buy a ticket these days," she sighed dramatically, her voice carrying the weight of someone witnessing the fall of civilization itself. "But money can't buy class, can it?" Jim turned around fully this time, his expression thoughtful but maintaining its inherent kindness. "You know what's funny about class?" he said, his voice carrying that distinctive Jim Carrey lilt that had delivered countless memorable lines. "It's a lot like happiness. The people who have it naturally don't need to show it off." The philosophical nature of his response caught Victoria off guard, but before she could formulate a suitably cutting reply, Sarah called out, "Sir, I can help you at this counter." Her voice was professional but carried an unmistakable warmth. As Jim approached the counter, Victoria's phone buzzed with responses to her social media updates about the deteriorating standards of first-class travel. Her followers, mostly fellow socialites and social climbers, were appropriately outraged on her behalf. None of them realized they were about to become supporting characters in a story that would soon circulate through social media for very different reasons. Sarah processed Jim's ticket with efficient movements, fighting to maintain her professional demeanor as he made a silly face while she took his ID photo for the security system. It was exactly the kind of spontaneous, joyful moment that had made him beloved worldwide. "Have a wonderful flight, Mr. C," Sarah said softly, returning his passport with a knowing smile. As Jim moved toward security, backpack still casually slung over his shoulder, Victoria stepped forward, designer luggage being rolled behind her by a porter she'd hired. "I don't know what this airline is thinking," she said to Sarah, not bothering to lower her voice. "There should be a dress code at the very least." Sarah looked at the woman, her customer service smile firmly in place. "Ma'am, we welcome all our first-class passengers equally, regardless of their choice of attire." She paused for a moment before adding, "Although I have to say, it's not every day we have someone of Mr. Carrey's caliber traveling with us." Victoria's expression shifted from smugness to confusion, then to horrified realization. "Mr. Carrey?" she repeated weakly. "Yes, ma'am, Jim Carrey. I believe he's on your flight." Sarah's smile remained professional, but there was a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "Now, may I see your ticket and identification?" Victoria fumbled with her designer bag, her perfectly manicured fingers suddenly clumsy. The other passengers in line, who had been witnesses to her previous behavior, were now either smirking or openly chuckling. The young boy from earlier was practically bouncing with excitement, having kept the secret perfectly until now. As Victoria handed over her documents, her face flushed with embarrassment, she caught sight of Jim Carrey going through security. He was making the TSA agents laugh as he went through the scanner, his natural charm and humor turning even that mundane process into something special. In that moment, Victoria Blackwood, with all her designer labels and social status, felt smaller than she ever had in her expensive Chanel heels. The first chapter of this flight was just beginning, and as Victoria watched Jim disappear into the terminal, she had a sinking feeling that her day was about to become a lot more interesting than she'd planned. What she didn't know was that this encounter would soon become a viral story about humility, prejudice, and the true meaning of class, and she wasn't going to like her role in it. Fate has a peculiar sense of humor, and today it was having a field day at Victoria Blackwood's expense. As she made her way down the luxurious first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, her Louboutin heels sinking into the plush carpet, she came to an abrupt halt at seat 2A. There, carefully reviewing the safety card with genuine interest, sat the very man she'd just finished humiliating herself in front of at the terminal. "There must be some mistake," Victoria muttered, double-checking her boarding pass for the 10th time. The flight attendant, Lisa Martinez, a veteran of 15 years with the airline, approached with a knowing smile. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Blackwood?" Lisa asked, though she was already well informed about the incident at check-in. News traveled fast among airport staff, especially when it involved their favorite celebrities and entitled passengers. "I specifically requested a seat away from the aisle," Victoria attempted, her voice strained with barely concealed desperation. "I apologize, but the flight is completely full," Lisa replied with practiced diplomacy. "Even in first class, we're at capacity today. Perhaps you'd like to take your seat? We're preparing for departure." Jim Carrey looked up, that same infectious smile playing on his lips. "Don't worry, neighbor," he said cheerfully, standing to let her access the window seat. "I promise I don't bite. Well, except that one time and once bitten, but that was strictly professional." He chuckled at his own reference to one of his earliest films. A few passengers who overheard snickered, but Victoria's face remained locked in a rictus of displeasure. As she attempted to maneuver past him, her Hermes Birkin bag somehow seemed larger than ever in the confined space. "Here, let me help you with that," Jim offered, reaching for her bag to store it in the overhead compartment. Before Victoria could protest, he had already lifted it alongside his worn backpack. "Please be careful with that," she snapped. "It's worth more than—" She caught herself just in time, but the implication hung in the air. "More than you could afford." Jim's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Then my entire wardrobe? Probably. But you know what they say about the best things in life being free." He settled back into his seat, pulling out a dog-eared copy of The Power of Now from his backpack. Victoria watched in horror as he stuffed the backpack into the overhead compartment with casual disregard for its contents. "First class?" she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Standards really have fallen.
She adjusted her seat with sharp, angry movements, as if trying to create a force field between herself and her seatmate. "You know what I love about air travel?" Jim said suddenly, turning to face her with animated enthusiasm. "It's like this amazing social experiment. You take people from all walks of life, put them in a metal tube 7 miles up in the sky, and watch what happens."
It's better than any reality show. A child in the row ahead poked his head between the seats, drawn by Jim's theatrical tone. "Mom, that man talks funny," he exclaimed with the unfiltered honesty of youth. Instead of being offended, Jim launched into one of his signature expressions, crossing his eyes and puffing out his cheeks. The boy dissolved into giggles, and several nearby passengers couldn't help but smile. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Some of us are trying to relax," she said pointedly, pulling out her silk eye mask. "Oh, relaxation. I'm great at that," Jim responded enthusiastically. He immediately adopted an exaggerated meditation pose, complete with crossed legs and extended arms. Would you like to join my Zen circle?" The flight attendant passing by had to stifle a laugh. Victoria's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "This is precisely why there should be a more rigorous screening process for first-class passengers," she said to no one in particular, though her voice carried through the cabin. An elderly gentleman across the aisle lowered his Wall Street Journal. "I don't know," he said with a slight smile. "I paid good money for first class, and I'm getting dinner and a show. Seems like a bargain to me." Several passengers chuckled, and Victoria's complexion darkened further. She aggressively pulled out her phone, firing off a series of angry texts before the flight attendant could remind her to switch it to airplane mode. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Jim settled into his seat, occasionally making subtle, funny faces at the children who kept stealing glances at him. His natural ability to find joy in any situation seemed to create an invisible divide in the first-class cabin. Those who were entertained by his presence, and Victoria, who sat stewing in her own mortification. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're number 3 for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." Lisa moved through the cabin for final checks, pausing briefly at their row. "Mr. Carrey, Mrs. Blackwood, can I get either of you anything before takeoff?" "Just your lovely smile," Jim replied warmly, causing Lisa to beam. "A double vodka martini," Victoria said through clenched teeth. "And please ensure it's Grey Goose, not that well garbage." "Of course, as soon as we're airborne," Lisa assured her. "Although I should mention that Mr. Carey's smile is complimentary, while the Grey Goose will be charged to your card." This drew another round of muffled laughter from the surrounding passengers. Victoria yanked her eye mask down and turned toward the window, her body language screaming, "Do not disturb," in every possible way. As the plane gathered speed for takeoff, Jim began humming softly, the theme from Leaving on a Jet Plane. Despite her best efforts to maintain her wall of irritation, Victoria found her foot tapping slightly to the rhythm before she caught herself and stopped abruptly. The next 5 hours stretched before them like an eternity. Victoria Blackwood, who had built her life around maintaining perfect control of her environment, was trapped beside the living embodiment of joyful chaos. As the plane lifted off the ground, banking toward its cruising altitude, she had no way of knowing that this flight would become one of the most memorable and humbling experiences of her life. Through the cabin window, the lights of Los Angeles twinkled below, gradually becoming distant stars as the aircraft climbed higher into the darkening sky. The city of dreams and illusions grew smaller, a fitting metaphor for how Victoria's carefully constructed facade would soon begin to crack, one Jim Carrey joke at a time. The Boeing 787 had reached its cruising altitude, settling into the smooth rhythm of transcontinental flight. Victoria Blackwood was on her 3rd Grey Goose martini, each sip accompanied by a grimace whenever Jim Carrey's distinctive laugh rang through the cabin. The sound, beloved by millions of fans worldwide, seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed barrier of superiority like a hot knife through butter. "Could you possibly contain yourself?" she hissed, after Jim shared a particularly energetic exchange with Lisa, the flight attendant, about the peculiar names of airplane snacks. "This isn't a comedy club in the valley." Jim turned to her with genuine curiosity. "You know, I've always wondered why they call them airplane nuts. Are they different from regular nuts?" Do they have tiny wings? These are the questions that keep me up at night. His face contorted into one of his signature expressions of exaggerated contemplation. A ripple of laughter spread through the first-class cabin. Even a distinguished-looking CEO type quickly converted his laugh into a cough when Victoria shot him a withering glare. Some people, Victoria announced to the cabin at large, adjusting her pearl necklace with manicured fingers, simply don't understand how to conduct themselves in refined company. She emphasized the word refined, as if it were a secret password to an exclusive club. Jim nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right. I once tried to be refined, but it gave me a terrible rash. Had to take medication and everything. He pulled out a bag of airplane peanuts, examining them with theatrical intensity. See? No wings. False advertising. Lisa approached their row with the dinner service, her professional demeanor barely concealing her amusement. Would you prefer the grilled salmon or the beef tenderloin? She asked. Before Victoria could respond, Jim piped up. I'll have whatever brings world peace. No pressure, though. His warm smile made Lisa break into genuine laughter. This isn't a comedy routine, Victoria snapped, her pearls clacking as she turned sharply. Some of us are trying to have a civilized flight experience. She tugged at her Chanel jacket, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. I'll have the salmon, and please ensure it's not overcooked like last time. Of course, Mrs. Blackwood, Lisa replied professionally. And for you, Mr. Carrey, beef tenderloin, please. And could I get an extra roll? I'm trying to carb load for my upcoming marathon of sitting completely still. He winked at Lisa, who had to bite her lip to maintain her composure. Victoria's eye roll was practically audible. Must you turn everything into a joke? This is precisely what I mean about standards dropping. First class used to be a sanctuary of sophistication. An elderly woman across the aisle lowered her book. Honey, I've been flying first class since before you were born, and I can tell you that good humor has always been welcome. Rudeness, on the other hand. She left the sentence hanging meaningfully. Jim's face lit up. Ma'am, you remind me of my grandmother. She always said that life's too short to be anything but kind, and that I should stop making faces or they'd freeze that way. Still waiting for that second part to happen, he demonstrated by crossing his eyes and puffing out his cheeks. The elderly woman chuckled warmly. I'm Margaret, dear, and I've seen all your movies. The Truman Show made me rethink my entire life. Victoria interjected. Well, some of us have more sophisticated taste in cinema. I prefer European art house films. She straightened her posture as if the very mention of foreign films made her more cultured. Oh, I love those too, Jim exclaimed. Especially the ones where people stare at empty coffee cups for 20 minutes while contemplating the existential significance of their sock choices. His deadpan delivery caused several passengers to snort into their drinks. As the dinner service continued, Victoria became increasingly agitated by the easy rapport Jim built with everyone around him. He knew the names of all the flight attendants within an hour, asked about their families, and somehow remembered every detail they shared. The service industry must maintain proper boundaries, Victoria declared after Jim thanked a flight attendant with a silly bow. It's inappropriate to be so familiar. Jim turned to her with genuine interest. You know what I find fascinating? How we've created these artificial boundaries between people. I mean, think about it. We're all just humans flying through space on a giant rock. But somehow we've convinced ourselves that some people are more important than others because of… What? The shine on their shoes? The labels on their clothes? His words, though delivered with his characteristic light-hearted tone, carried a weight that made several passengers nod thoughtfully. Victoria, however, was not amused. Some people simply understand proper social conduct, she said, fingering her pearls again. Others clearly never learned. Oh, I learned, Jim responded cheerfully. I just had to unlearn it all to stay sane. Much more fun this way, he demonstrated by attempting to eat his beef tenderloin with exaggerated posh mannerisms, pinky finger extended to ridiculous heights. A young businessman in the row behind them couldn't contain his laughter. Man, this is better than any in-flight entertainment I've ever had. Victoria's cheeks flushed red. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Everything is a joke to you, isn't it? Don't you ever take anything seriously? Jim's expression softened slightly. I take joy very seriously. Laughter is sacred. In a world where everyone's trying so hard to prove they're better than everyone else, Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just be silly. His words hung in the air, carrying more wisdom than Victoria was comfortable acknowledging. She turned to her salmon, cutting it into increasingly smaller pieces, while pointedly ignoring the thoughtful murmurs of agreement from surrounding passengers. As the flight continued, the first-class cabin had transformed into an unlikely comedy club at 35,000 feet. Jim's natural charm and genuine warmth had created a community out of strangers, with Victoria as the only holdout, an island of forced sophistication in a sea of genuine humanity. The irony wasn't lost on the other passengers. The woman so concerned with appearing refined was the only one displaying anything close to crude behavior. With each passing moment, her carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbled a little more, though she clung to it with increasing desperation. Little did Victoria know, but her greatest humiliation was yet to come, and it would arrive in the form of an excited child's recognition. For now, though, she remained entrenched in her position, a self-appointed guardian of standards that existed only in her mind, while Jim Carrey continued to prove that true class had nothing to do with designer labels or proper etiquette, and everything to do with how you treat others. 3 hours into the flight, the first-class cabin had settled into what seemed like two distinct worlds. In one, Jim Carrey had created an atmosphere of warmth and laughter, while in the other, Victoria Blackwood maintained her icy fortress of superiority, though its walls were showing signs of wear from the constant assault of joy surrounding her. 8-year-old Tommy Anderson had been fidgeting in his seat for the past hour, periodically turning around to steal glances at the funny man in row 2. His mother, Sarah, a middle school teacher who had splurged on first-class tickets for their special trip to New York, kept gently reminding him to face forward. But there was something about that man's smile, something so familiar that it had been nagging at Tommy's young mind since they boarded. Victoria was in the middle of another commentary about the declining standards of air travel, when Tommy's eyes suddenly went wide with recognition. The revelation hit him like a bolt of lightning, and his excitement couldn't be contained any longer. "Mom! Mom!" Tommy practically bounced out of his seat, pointing back at row 2. "It's Jim Carrey! Look! It's really him! It's Ace Ventura!" The words rang through the cabin like a starter's pistol, shattering the careful balance that had been maintained. Victoria's hand, which had been raising her 4th martini to her lips, froze midway. The olive in her drink trembled slightly as the reality of her situation crashed down around her designer outfit. Jim, rather than showing any annoyance at being recognized, immediately sprang into action. His face morphed into the iconic Ace Ventura expression, complete with the distinctive hair flip and exaggerated jaw movements. "Do not go in there. Whew," he quoted, causing Tommy to shriek with delight. The entire first-class cabin erupted in laughter, not just at Jim's performance, but at the absolutely mortified expression on Victoria's face. The color drained from her carefully made-up features as the weight of her previous behavior settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "You're the Grinch too," Tommy continued, now fully turned around in his seat. "Do the face! Do the face!" Jim didn't disappoint. His features contorted into the signature Grinch sneer, and in that gravelly voice he proclaimed, "Am I just eating because I'm bored?" Sarah, Tommy's mother, was both mortified and amused. "Tommy, honey, sit down. We shouldn't disturb." "Please, this is the best part of my day," Jim insisted, standing up to better project his performance. He turned to the cabin at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, in honor of young Tommy here, we're going to have an impromptu game of Name That Jim Carrey Character." The first-class cabin, already won over by his previous charm, enthusiastically joined in. Margaret, the elderly woman who had defended him earlier, called out, "Oh, do Bruce Almighty!" Jim immediately shifted personas, looking skyward with mock frustration. "God is just a mean kid with a magnifying glass, and I'm the ant. He could fix my life in 5 minutes if he wanted to." But no, the cabin roared with appreciation. Victoria sat rigid in her seat, her face a mask of horrified realization. Every snide comment she'd made, every condescending remark about standards and proper behavior, played back in her mind like a particularly uncomfortable highlight reel. She had spent the last 3 hours attempting to humiliate one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, and he had responded with nothing but kindness and humor. The businessman behind them couldn't resist joining in. "Do the mask! Somebody stop me!" Jim's face stretched into that legendary manic grin, and in character, he turned to Victoria. "Smokin'," he declared, causing another wave of laughter to wash through the cabin. Lisa, the flight attendant, was barely maintaining her professional composure. "Mr. Carrey, I hate to interrupt, but I've had several requests from Coach asking what all the laughter is about. Well, we can't let them miss out on the fun, can we?" Jim stood up, looking at the curtain separating the cabins with a mischievous glint in his eye. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak. You're really Jim Carrey, actor, comedian, painter, and apparently the cause of declining standards in first-class travel." He gave her a warm, genuine smile. "The very same, though I prefer to think of myself as a professional spreader of joy and occasional maker of questionable fashion choices." The irony of her earlier behavior was not lost on anyone in the cabin. Several passengers who had witnessed her earlier disdain were now watching with varying degrees of schadenfreude as she struggled to process the situation. Tommy, still bouncing with excitement, called out, "Do Lloyd from Dumb and Dumber?" Jim's face lit up. "The perfect choice for this moment." He turned to Victoria, and in Lloyd's signature voice asked, "What was all that 1 in a million talk?" The cabin once again dissolved into laughter, everyone now fully aware of the beautiful cosmic joke that had been playing out before them. Victoria's perfectly manicured hands fidgeted with her pearl necklace, her normally sharp tongue tied in knots of embarrassment. Every judgment she had passed, every snide remark about his clothes, his behavior, his presence in first class, all of it now reflected back on her, revealing far more about her character than his. A young woman in the row ahead, who had been quietly recording parts of Jim's impromptu performance on her phone, whispered to her seatmate, "This is going viral for sure." Victoria overheard this and seemed to shrink further into her seat, suddenly very aware that her behavior might soon be public knowledge. Jim, noticing her discomfort, did something that proved why he was not just a great comedian, but a truly class act. He turned to the cabin and said, "You know what the best part about flying is? For a few hours, we're all just people in the sky together. No studios, no red carpets, no social status. Just humans sharing an adventure at 35,000 feet. His words, delivered with genuine warmth, offered Victoria a graceful way to save face, if she was willing to take it. The question now was whether she could swallow her pride and accept the olive branch being extended to her, or if she would remain trapped in her self-imposed prison of superiority. The moment hung in the air like the plane itself, suspended between heaven and earth, waiting to see which way it would fall. And in that moment, Victoria Blackwood had a choice to make, one that would determine not just how the rest of this flight would go, but perhaps how she would view herself and others from this point forward. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted dramatically. Victoria Blackwood, who had spent the first half of the flight building walls of condescension, now found those same walls crumbling around her as passengers began sharing their favorite Jim Carrey moments. What could have devolved into a public shaming instead transformed into something entirely unexpected, thanks to the very man she had spent hours trying to belittle. "Eternal sunshine of the spotless mind changed my life," shared Margaret, the elderly woman who had earlier defended Jim. "I watched it after losing my husband of 40 years. It helped me understand that the pain of loss was worth bearing to keep the beautiful memories." Jim's characteristic smile softened into something more contemplative. "You know, that role taught me something profound too. Sometimes the things that hurt us the most are also the things that make us who we are." Victoria found herself listening despite her embarrassment. Her fingers had stopped fidgeting with her pearl necklace, and her rigid posture had begun to relax imperceptibly. Tommy, still excited from the earlier revelation, could barely contain himself. "My dad and I watch Bruce Almighty every Sunday. He says it's funny but also makes you think about stuff." "Out of the mouths of babes," Jim replied, grinning. "Your dad sounds like a wise man, Tommy. Sometimes the best way to understand serious things is to laugh at them a little." The businessman who had been sitting behind them cleared his throat. "I actually saw The Truman Show during a really tough time in my corporate career. It made me question whether I was living my life or just playing a role others expected of me." Victoria's breath caught slightly at these words. She glanced down at her Chanel suit, her Louboutin shoes, her Hermès bag, all the careful trappings of the role she played every day. Jim noticed her reaction and did something unexpected. Instead of allowing her to remain the outsider, he deliberately drew her into the conversation. "You know, Victoria, I bet you have a favorite movie too." "Everyone does. It's one of those things that connects us all." The cabin fell quiet, waiting for her response. Victoria felt the weight of every eye upon her, but for the first time during the flight, she didn't detect judgment in those gazes, only curiosity and a chance for redemption. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, gathering her courage, she continued, "I actually saw The Mask during my first date with my ex-husband. He laughed so hard he spilled his entire drink on my new dress, but I didn't even care. It was the last time I remember not caring about appearing perfect." The vulnerability in her admission created a moment of genuine connection. Jim's face lit up with appreciation for her honesty. "Now, that's what I call a review, though I hope I wasn't responsible for too many dry cleaning bills." The cabin filled with warm laughter, and this time, Victoria found herself joining in, albeit tentatively. It was as if a pressure valve had been released, allowing the tension of the past few hours to dissipate. Lisa, the flight attendant, joined in with her own story. "My brother and I must have watched Dumb and Dumber 100 times growing up. We still quote it at family gatherings." "Mock, yeah!" Jim immediately responded in character, causing Lisa to burst into delighted laughter. "Bird? Yeah!" Several passengers joined in, creating an impromptu chorus that had even the most reserved travelers grinning. Victoria watched as the first-class cabin, usually a fortress of quiet privilege, transformed into a space of shared joy and genuine connection. The expensive clothes and accessories that had seemed so important earlier now felt strangely irrelevant. A young couple celebrating their honeymoon chimed in about "Yes, man," inspiring them to take more chances in life. A teacher mentioned using clips from How the Grinch Stole Christmas to teach her students about empathy and personal growth. Jim listened to each story with genuine interest, occasionally adding behind-the-scenes details or personal reflections that made each person's connection to his work feel even more special. But more importantly, he kept finding ways to include Victoria in the conversation, gently helping her transition from antagonist to participant. "You know what's amazing?" he mused, after a particularly heartfelt story. "Every one of these movies meant something different to each person here. Victoria's story about The Mask is just as valuable as Tommy's love for Bruce Almighty, or Margaret's connection to Eternal Sunshine. That's the magic of stories. They meet us where we are." Victoria felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, threatening to ruin her perfect makeup. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't care about maintaining her image. "I've been horrible," she admitted quietly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I've spent this entire flight judging and criticizing when I could have been connecting and sharing." Jim turned to her with genuine warmth. "Hey, character development is what makes any story worth telling, and this flight still has a few chapters left." The cabin hummed with approval and acceptance. What had started as a tense situation had transformed into something none of them had expected, a moment of genuine community at 35,000 feet. Sarah, Tommy's mother, reached over and squeezed Victoria's hand. "We all have our moments. What matters is what we learn from them." As the sharing of stories continued, the first-class cabin felt less like an exclusive club and more like a cozy living room. The invisible barriers that usually separated strangers on planes had dissolved, replaced by the kind of connection that only comes from shared laughter and honest vulnerability. Victoria Blackwood, who had boarded the plane believing her designer label set her apart, was discovering that true class had nothing to do with what you wore or how much you paid for your seat. It was about how you treated others, and more importantly, how willing you were to let down your guard and be genuinely human. The flight still had some time left, and Victoria's journey of transformation was not yet complete. But as she sat there, listening to the warm chatter and occasional bursts of laughter around her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the simple joy of being part of something larger than herself, without any need to prove her worth through external tokens of status. As the plane began its descent into New York, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom announcing their imminent arrival. Victoria Blackwood, who had boarded the flight as a paragon of social superiority, found herself experiencing something unfamiliar, genuine regret mixed with an overwhelming urge to make amends. The first-class cabin had transformed during their journey. The invisible walls of status and pretense had melted away, replaced by an atmosphere of warmth and authentic connection. As the aircraft descended through the clouds, Victoria gathered her courage for what she knew she needed to do. "Mr. Carrey," she began, her voice softer than it had been all flight. "I owe you an apology." Her fingers instinctively reached for her pearl necklace, but stopped midway, a small yet significant break from her nervous habit. Jim turned to her with that characteristic twinkle in his eyes. "An apology? Hold that thought." He suddenly adopted a serious expression and pulled an imaginary microphone from his pocket. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to you live from Flight 2847, where we're about to witness a rare phenomenon, a genuine moment of human connection. Don't touch that dial." His playful response drew chuckles from the surrounding passengers, but more importantly, it put Victoria at ease. She found herself smiling despite her nervousness. "I've been absolutely horrible," she continued, color rising in her cheeks. "I judged you based on appearances, acted condescending, and made assumptions that say far more about my own insecurities than anything else." Jim adopted his best game show host voice. "And what's behind door number 1? Could it be personal growth?" He switched to his "The Mask" voice. "Somebody stop her. She's on a roll." The cabin erupted in laughter, including, to her own surprise, Victoria herself. His ability to transform even this moment of contrition into something joyful was precisely the lesson she needed. "You see," Jim said, dropping the act and speaking with genuine warmth, "sometimes we need to laugh at ourselves to understand that appearances are the smallest part of who we are. Life's too short to be trapped in the prison of other people's expectations, or even our own." Tommy, who had been listening intently from his seat ahead, turned around with the unfiltered wisdom that only children possess. "My mom says that when you laugh, your heart grows bigger." "Your mom is a very wise woman, Tommy," Jim replied, then turned back to Victoria. "You know what I love about this moment? It's completely unscripted. The best moments in life usually are." As the plane touched down at JFK International Airport, Victoria found herself reflecting on the journey. Not just the physical distance covered, but the emotional terrain she had traversed. The designer labels she wore, which had seemed so important hours ago, now felt like costume pieces in a play she'd been performing for too long. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "welcome to New York City. Local time is 7:45 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 72 degrees. Please remain seated until we reach the gate." As the aircraft taxied to its final position, Jim stood up and took a theatrical bow. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Try the fish, or in this case, the airplane chicken." The entire cabin broke into applause, not just for his humor, but for the unique experience they had all shared. Flight attendant Lisa, who had witnessed the entire transformation, couldn't resist joining in. "Best flight ever." As passengers began gathering their belongings, Victoria watched as Jim took time to interact with everyone who approached him. He posed for photos, making his signature funny faces, signed a few autographs, and treated each person as if they were the most important individual in the world. "How do you do it?" she asked him as they waited to deplane. "How do you stay so genuine?" Jim's response was thoughtful. "You know what I've learned? True luxury isn't about what we wear or where we sit. It's about the freedom to be authentically ourselves, and the ability to help others feel comfortable being themselves too." As they made their way through the terminal, Victoria noticed something remarkable. Despite his celebrity status, Jim created a bubble of joy around him that included everyone, from the ground crew to the customs officers.
He treated everyone with the same respect and humor, regardless of their uniform or position. A small crowd had gathered, word having spread that Jim Carrey was on the flight. Instead of rushing past, he took time to acknowledge everyone, turning the arrivals area into an impromptu comedy show. Victoria stood back, watching as he brought smiles to countless faces.
"You know," Margaret said, appearing beside Victoria with her carry-on, "some people spend their whole lives accumulating wealth and status, only to discover that the real treasure was in the connections they could have made along the way." Victoria nodded, understanding the gentle wisdom in those words. She looked down at her Louboutin heels and designer outfit and, for the first time, saw them for what they were, beautiful accessories, but not the measure of her worth. Before leaving, she approached Jim one last time. "Thank you," she said simply. Not just for forgiving my behavior, but for showing me a better way to exist in the world. Jim responded with his signature smile. Hey, we're all just walking each other home, as Ram Dass would say. Some of us just make funny faces along the way. He then crossed his eyes and puffed out his cheeks one last time, causing Victoria to laugh genuinely, a sound she realized had been far too rare in her life. As she walked toward the taxi stand, Victoria could still hear laughter echoing from the terminal behind her. She had boarded that flight believing she was above it all, only to discover that she had been missing out on the best parts of life. The true luxury, she now understood, wasn't in the exclusive first-class cabin or the designer clothes she wore. It was in the ability to connect with others, to laugh freely, and to find joy in unexpected places. Her phone buzzed with notifications. Apparently, several videos from the flight had already gone viral. But for the first time in her life, Victoria Blackwood didn't care about her public image. She was too busy planning how to bring more authentic joy into her world, one genuine smile at a time.